In the winter of 1941, Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg against Moscow was halted and pushed back. After that defeat, by mid-1942, Adolf Hitler realized that the Soviet Union could not be subdued quickly through a lightning war. The conflict had entered a war of attrition, and to win, Germany had to focus on the enemy's vital resources. Hitler chose the southern front of the Soviet Union, home to vast wheat fields, coal mines, and above all, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. The strategic goal of the 1942 summer offensive, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, was to seize the oil fields of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku, while cutting off the transport route along the Volga River, the lifeline connecting the southern and northern Soviet territories. In this context, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, a major industrial city on the Volga, became a critical target. It was a strategic transportation hub, the gateway for moving oil from the Caucasus to the north. Capturing Stalingrad would not only allow the Germans to control this vital route, but also secure the northern flank of their advance into the Caucasus. But the city also held symbolic importance. It bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad would strike a heavy blow to Soviet morale. For the USSR, defending it was a matter of national honor. In the summer of 1942, Hitler mobilized Army Group South, comprising dozens of divisions, to strike toward both the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Under the plan, Army Group A would move into the Caucasus, while Army Group B, including the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the 4th Panzer Army, and allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, would capture Stalingrad and hold the Volga front. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blau began. German forces swept across the southern steppe, winning a string of victories thanks to their mobility and the power of the Luftwaffe. By July, they had crossed the Don River, seized Voronezh, July 7th, and forced the Soviets to abandon Rostov by the month's end. Deep armored thrusts tore massive gaps in the Red Army's defenses, forcing the Soviets to commit their last reserves to seal the breaches. On July 28th, in this dire situation, Stalin issued order number 227. Not one step back, enforcing iron discipline to prevent any retreat. Every available fighter, from regular troops to civilian militias, was sent to defend Stalingrad. Defensive lines were established at the city's gateway, near a bend of the Don River. The 62nd and 64th Armies held the west bank, backs to the river, determined not to let the enemy cross. With no path of retreat, they had no choice but to hold their ground to the last. On August 23, 1942, the spearhead of Germany's 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad with the shimmering Volga River visible ahead. That same day, the Luftwaffe unleashed an unprecedented air raid. Over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped within 24 hours, burning much of the city and turning it into a sea of fire. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and the entire city shook under the onslaught. In the following days, relentless carpet bombing flattened large sections of the city, leaving behind a dead city buried under rubble. Yet the ruins became a natural fortress for the Soviet defenders. When German units pushed into the city's edges, they quickly realized Stalingrad would not fall easily. Under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet 62nd Army clung to every street and every pile of bricks, ready to trade blood for every meter of ground. The northern and southern suburbs soon fell to the Germans, splitting the Soviet defenders in two. At points where the Germans reached the west bank of the Volga, the Soviets risked crossing the river at night to send reinforcements, one battalion at a time, holding fragile bridgeheads. Among these reinforcements was the 13th Guards Rifle Regiment under Colonel Alexander Rodimtsev, whose men, upon landing, immediately counterattacked to retake key high ground. From that point, the battle became an unprecedented street-fighting nightmare. Both sides fought over individual houses, walls, and even floors. By day, German artillery and aircraft hammered Soviet positions. By night, the Red Army launched surprise counterattacks. Landmarks such as Mamayev-Kurgan Hill, Railway Station No. 1, Pavlov's House, and the Tractor, Barricade, and Red October factories changed hands repeatedly. German soldiers called it the Rat War, room by room, cellar to cellar fighting, where the enemy could appear without warning from behind a collapsed wall or on a rooftop. Tanks and heavy artillery were almost useless in the shattered cityscape, and casualties mounted at every street corner. As the Soviet lines were pushed into narrow strips along the river, Field Marshal Paulus ordered a massive assault on the northern industrial sector. German infantry and armor stormed the tractor plant and Barricade factory, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Soviet paratroopers made suicidal charges to stop the tanks, while Katyusha rocket batteries from the east bank poured fire in support. The Germans seized part of the factories, pushing Soviet forces back to the water's edge. Some Soviet units, trapped in narrow riverbank pockets only tens of meters from the Volga, held out for days under constant attack. By mid-November 1942, the Germans controlled about 90% of Stalingrad. Only a thin strip along the river remained in Soviet hands, stubborn strongpoints waiting for the right moment to strike back. Paulus did not realize that the long flanks of his 6th Army were held only by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, forces badly weakened and poorly equipped. The Soviet High Command saw this as the enemy's fatal weakness and was secretly concentrating massive forces for a decisive counterstroke, Operation Uranus. At dawn on November 19th, 1942, as a pale sun began to break over the frozen steppe, the sky suddenly shook with the roar of over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars. Salvo after salvo thundered into the positions of Romanian troops holding the northern flank of Stalingrad. Mixed in with the crash of heavy guns was the distinctive shriek of hundreds of Katyusha rocket launchers, unleashing blinding volleys of fire that rained down on the enemy. This was the opening blow of Operation Uranus, a massive combined arms double envelopment. On the northern axis, the Southwestern Front under General Nikolai Vatutin committed 3 full armies, spearheaded by over 1,000 T-34s, KV-1s, and self-propelled guns supported by mechanized infantry. The early morning mist was torn apart by the roar of engines and the grinding of steel tracks over the ice. The defensive lines of Romania's 3rd Army, lacking effective anti-tank weapons, crumbled almost instantly. Within hours, the Soviet spearheads had driven 25 to 30 kilometers deep, leaving behind burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, and dead littering the trenches. On the morning of November 20th, on Stalingrad's southern flank, the Stalingrad Front under General Alexander Yeremenko launched a similar assault against Romania's 4th Army along the Don River. The attack opened with a storm of fire from thousands of guns and Katyushas, turning defensive positions into a sea of smoke. As the barrage lifted, waves of T-34s and infantry surged forward, smashing through the already faltering defenses. Romanian infantry, armed mostly with rifles and light machine guns, had no chance of stopping the armored tide. From both north and south, the Soviet armored spearheads bypassed isolated pockets of resistance, accelerating across snow-covered fields. Tank columns thundered westward, overrunning supply convoys and severing communications, driving straight into the German rear. On November 23, 1942, at the town of Kalach, the 2 Soviet pincers met. Cheers and gunfire erupted as soldiers from both fronts shook hands amid the freezing wind and drifting smoke. The massive encirclement had closed. trapping all German and Allied forces in the Stalingrad pocket. Around 330,000 troops, the entirety of the German 6th Army, part of the 4th Panzer Army, and Romanian and Italian units were now sealed inside a 100-kilometer-wide Kessel. The shock was immediate. German field commanders urged General Friedrich Paulus to break out, while the Soviets were still consolidating their outer ring. In reality, the last days of November were the best, and perhaps only, chance for escape. But from his headquarters in Obersalzberg, Adolf Hitler forbade any withdrawal, ordering Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs, as he had previously done at Leningrad and Moscow. That blind confidence was bolstered by Field Marshal Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could sustain the encircled army with an air bridge, as it had, to a far lesser extent, at Demyansk earlier in 1942. In reality, the task was impossible. Nearly 500 tons of supplies were needed daily to sustain almost 300,000 men. But even under the best conditions, the Luftwaffe delivered barely 100 tons, less than 1/5 of the requirement. By December, worsening weather and deadly Soviet anti-aircraft fire were shooting down Ju-52 transports in large numbers, and many supply drops fell straight into Soviet hands. Inside the Kessel, German troops were slowly starved. Ammunition and medicine dwindled. Rations dropped to a few hundred grams of stale bread a day. Paulus tightened his defensive lines into the ruined urban terrain, forming a perimeter of about 60 kilometers. According to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, some 290,000 German and Allied troops, along with more than 10,000 Soviet civilians unable to evacuate, were trapped inside. Beyond the pocket, General Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Don Front established 2 rings, an inner cordon to strangle the trapped forces and an outer cordon to repel any relief attempts. Soon after, German High Command entrusted Field Marshal Manstein, newly appointed to lead the Don Army Group, with launching a counteroffensive, the last faint hope of rescuing Paulus. By mid-December 1942, despite the risk of Soviet offensives erupting across the entire front, Adolf Hitler committed the last of his reserves to save the encircled army at Stalingrad. The plan, codenamed Operation Wintergitter, Winter Storm, placed overall command in the hands of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The main strike force was the 57th Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army, led by General Hermann Hoth, tasked with attacking from the southwest, breaking through the Soviet ring, and driving straight into Stalingrad. Manstein assembled 3 elite panzer and mechanized divisions, supported by several infantry and paratrooper divisions withdrawn from the Caucasus. On December 12, 1942, Hoth's spearhead rolled out from Kotelnikovo, about 160 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. In the opening days, Hoth's attack achieved surprise. The armored spearhead smashed aside Soviet forward units and advanced rapidly across the snow-covered steppe. After a week of fighting, the 57th Panzer Corps had crossed the Aksai River and reached the approaches to the Mishkova River, now only 50 kilometers from General Friedrich Paulus and the trapped 6th Army. Inside the Stalingrad Kessel, Paulus and his senior officers watched this final glimmer of hope draw closer. They proposed launching a breakout to meet Hoth's advance, but Hitler refused. On December 18, 1942, with Hoth just 40 kilometers from the city, Manstein urgently appealed to Hitler to authorize Paulus to attack outward and link up. Hitler's answer was an uncompromising, hold your ground order. The 6th Army was to remain in place and fight to the last man. Fate struck a cruel blow. Just as the Germans were pouring strength into the relief effort, on December 16, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, striking the Italian 8th Army along the Don River west of Stalingrad. In less than 2 weeks, the Italian 8th Army was annihilated, creating a gaping hole in the rear of Manstein's relief force. Facing the risk of a Soviet breakthrough and the severing of his own lines of retreat, Manstein halted Operation Wintergitter. He immediately diverted the 6th Panzer Division at his last reserve to counter the new threat on the western flank. Without reinforcements, Hoth's spearhead froze in place, unable to advance further. Under mounting Soviet counterattacks, German forces pulled back from the Mishkova River by the end of December, ending all hope of rescuing the 6th Army. Operation Winter Storm had failed, leaving over 40,000 German dead on the battlefield, along with nearly all the tanks and artillery committed to the operation. For the 6th Army trapped in Stalingrad, Manstein's withdrawal was nothing short of a death sentence. From late December 1942, even the tenuous air supply dwindled and then stopped altogether. The Soviets systematically seized the improvised airfields used by the Luftwaffe. On January 16, 1943, the Potomnik airfield fell. On January 23rd, Gumrak, the last functioning airstrip inside the pocket, was captured. From then on, the Germans had no supply or evacuation route other than a few desperate airdrops. Inside the city, tens of thousands of troops sank into exhaustion. Hunger, cold, and disease ravaged them in the brutal minus 30 degrees Celsius winter. Deaths from starvation and freezing soon outnumbered those from combat. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers wandered among the rubble searching for shelter, alongside 20,000 wounded groaning in damp cellars without medicine. Food and ammunition were gone. Morale collapsed. Field Marshal Paulus later admitted that his men had slipped rapidly into a state of total exhaustion, both physically and mentally, in the final weeks at Stalingrad. Realizing that the German forces inside the Kessel were exhausted, the Soviet High Command decided to launch the final operation to wipe out the 6th Army. Codenamed Koltso, the Ring, the assault began on the morning of January 10, 1943, after Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus rejected an ultimatum to surrender issued on January 8th. More than 7,000 Soviet guns opened fire in a massive barrage, clearing the way for infantry and tanks to advance. Waves of artillery rained down on German positions. Then T-34s roared forward, crushing defensive strongpoints street by street. Though near collapse, German units resisted fiercely in some areas, but the Red Army adjusted tactics. Strongholds were bypassed and isolated, while the main thrust shifted rapidly to other targets. Within days, German forces were split into smaller pockets and pushed deeper into the city's ruins. By January 17, 1943, after a week of fighting, the Soviets paused to regroup and realign their attack. At this stage, the area under German control had shrunk to less than a quarter of its original size. From far away, Hitler still sent orders to hold to the last man, but such commands over the radio could not change the brutal reality on the ground. On January 22nd, the Soviets resumed their all-out assault. 4 days later, on January 26th, Soviet assault groups linked up in the city center, cutting the 6th Army into 2 isolated pockets. The northern sector, under General Karl Strecker, held out in the shattered tractor factory complex. The southern sector, including Paulus's headquarters, entrenched itself in the city center. The final battles raged beneath collapsed buildings, with Soviet troops fighting room to room and calling for the Germans to surrender through loudspeakers. Knowing the situation was hopeless, Paulus requested Hitler's permission to capitulate and save the remaining lives. Instead, on January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a gesture laden with the expectation that he commit suicide, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last breath or take his own life, never to fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. But Paulus, a devout Catholic, refused to kill himself for hollow glory, declaring, "I have no intention of wasting my life for such an empty honor." On the morning of January 31st, 1943, in the cold basement of the ruined Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his staff stepped forward to surrender to the Red Army. Paulus thus became the first field marshal in Nazi Germany's history to be captured alive, defying Hitler's orders to save the men who still remain. The southern German pocket collapsed almost immediately after this. On February 2nd, 1943, General Strecker and the remnants of the northern pocket also laid down their arms. The last gunshots fell silent over the ashes of Stalingrad. The bloodiest battle in human history had ended after 163 days, with about 91,000 German and Axis troops taken prisoner by the Soviets, including 24 generals. The defeated soldiers, starving, freezing, and many gravely wounded, were ordered to march out of the city's ruins. Heads bowed, they trudged toward Soviet POW camps, beginning long years of harsh captivity in the frozen wastes of Siberia. At his headquarters, upon hearing of Paulus's surrender, Hitler flew into a rage. He shouted to his staff, "How can a man like him surrender to the Bolsheviks after seeing 50 to 60,000 of his own men fight to the death?" To Hitler, the loss at Stalingrad was a reversed Thermopylae. He had hoped the Sixth Army would fight to the death like the legendary 300 Spartans, but it was not to be. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with a resounding Soviet victory and the most devastating defeat suffered by Nazi Germany since the outbreak of World War II. The Sixth Army, once praised by Hitler as the strongest formation in the Wehrmacht, was completely annihilated. Of the roughly 300,000 German and Axis troops trapped in the encirclement, more than 100,000 were killed on the battlefield, and 91,000, including 24 generals, were taken prisoner. In reality, the vast majority of these POWs never returned home. Only about 5,000 to 6,000 survived to be repatriated to Germany after the war, a survival rate of less than 6%. For the Soviet Union, the cost of victory was staggering. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded in the defense of the city, alongside tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Stalingrad itself was reduced to rubble, a city almost completely leveled, with nothing left but charred walls and shattered foundations. Yet this victory became an immense source of morale for both the Red Army and the Soviet people. It marked the moment when Soviet forces shifted from a defensive posture to an all-out offensive, launching a series of relentless counteroffensives across the entire Eastern Front. In strategic terms, Stalingrad was a decisive turning point. The defeat stripped Hitler's forces of all initiative in the East. From a position of expansion, the Wehrmacht was forced into a defensive stance, continually absorbing the impact of ever larger Soviet offensives in the years that followed. The Soviet triumph at Stalingrad, combined with the Allied victory in North Africa, Tunisia, May 1943, ended the Axis threat of global domination and triggered a major shift in the course of the war. From this point onward, strategic momentum passed entirely to the Allies. 2.5 years later, in May 1945, Nazi Germany was forced to sign an unconditional surrender, closing the darkest chapter in human history. And amid the ruins of Stalingrad, the story of resilience and sacrifice endured, an eternal symbol of the will to fight to the end for freedom and independence.